You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and NACS. I'm joined by my co-host,
Donovan Woods, also with the Fuels Institute and NACS.
And Donovan, today we're going to be talking about something that everybody's talking about because in every headline, it's electric vehicles. And we're going to talk about specifically what kind of charging infrastructure is going to be required. We're going to have Philip Sheehy with ICF International, who's been doing some work for the Fuels Institute, to start diving into what we can expect in the future in terms of electric vehicle recharging capabilities. And Philip Sheehy with ICF, welcome to Convenience Matters. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Appreciate you joining us. And you've been working with the Fuels Institute now for about a year and a half on a project looking at the electric vehicle market and recharging infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and ICF, kind of set the stage where you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a director with ICF. I sit in the transportation and energy part of ICF. So we're a consultancy, a medium-sized consulting firm that provides strategic consulting and for a variety of clients, including public and commercial clients. My team, in particular, does a lot of work in the alternative fuels and advanced vehicle space, and then we also do some work in obviously the traditional oil gas space. But mainly, our main areas of focus are electric vehicles. We do work in the biofuel space on both the gaseous and the liquid side. And that work is across the country now for a variety of utilities and public agencies, and a lot of that has been shifting towards or has been focused on strategic planning around transportation electrification more broadly, with obviously a near-term focus on some of the stuff in the light-duty sector and some of those passenger cars and stuff like that.
And you're located in California. It's basically the hotbed in the United States for the electric vehicle market, right?
That's right. I'm in Southern California in San Diego, and I've been down here for about 2 years, moved down here. But before that was in San Francisco, so right in the thick of, two of the big areas for electrification here in California.
So there may be some people going to be listening to this podcast who have never seen an electric vehicle if they live in like Montana, North Dakota, or something like that. But they're basically everyday occurrences on every single corner in your area, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially here in San Diego, same thing. And I mean, I remember when I started doing this, 2011, 2012, I would take flack from friends and family for pointing out electric vehicles when they first started showing up on the street, and now that'd be a waste of everybody's time. So yeah, definitely, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Philip, we're here in the DC area, and in another lifetime, I used to work for ICF and the contract specialist at the headquarters in Fairfax. So we see a lot of electric vehicles now, and honestly, I've come across more Model 3s lately than I ever have in the last year, and I'm assuming they're finally being built and they're finally being delivered. But can you tell me something that I can't remember, and just in case any of our viewers want to find out or listeners want to find out where they can go to find out more about ICF, what does ICF stand for?
ICF no longer stands for anything. That's a great trivia question.
It's like NACS.
Yes. But when it started in 1969, ICF stood for the Inner City Fund. It was founded by some former government workers, and the version of the story, at least that I'm familiar with, is that they were kind of ahead of their time with some concepts related to kind of micro venture financing, is what we would call it now. They were going to do investments within the inner city there, actually in the DC area. They were government contractors, and they were doing government consulting on the side to pay the bills. And the venture funding never really took off. This was in the obviously late 60s, so I think they were a bit ahead of their time. And I think after a couple of years, when the government contracting was paying the bills, they decided to stick with that, and then we've kind of diversified since. But yeah, Inner City Fund. But yeah, I'm not even sure you can find it online anymore. But that's the story that I've been told.
So let's dive a little bit into some of the research you've been doing for the Fuels Institute. We see the headlines, Donovan, about electric vehicles are coming. All the auto companies are going to electric. GM's all in on electric. Ford's all in on electric. All these headlines make convenience fuel retailers a little nervous about what the future is. But Philip, you've taken a very pragmatic approach to kind of evaluating where the market is and where it's heading. Where do you see the market going in terms of electric vehicles? How fast do we expect them to grow market share, and what might be the primary factors that are leading towards market growth?
Yeah, those are great questions. And this industry right now, or this market in general, is really, I think, obsessed with or really keen on trying to understand how fast this is going to happen and what is the decreasing slope of battery prices. And so working with the Fuels Institute was great. I'm not just saying that because I'm with you guys, but in part because there was no pressure to put something out there that was like that was basically saying electrification is going to happen overnight. Battery prices are falling off of a cliff, and these vehicles are going to be dirt cheap. So, ultimately, we take a very measured view of the market. And on the balance of things, we find that there are more tailwinds for electrification than there are headwinds. So that's the quick summary of what we're looking at with respect to adoption, with EV adoption, is that the vehicles are becoming more affordable. People's awareness of the vehicles is kind of middling. It hasn't really advanced as quickly as maybe folks would have liked. We've seen some latent interest or some latent uptake associated with the Model 3, with Tesla delivering those. So you have seen a surge of the vehicles come online, but generally there are some headwinds too, like with respect to electrification, gasoline remains cheap. Consumers are very interested. You guys did a great podcast the other day on the crossovers, or the popularity of sport utilities and crossovers, and there's been a lot of articles about that. And there aren't very many electric vehicle options in that category, or in those segments, So, and then how things are going to evolve with respect to the federal fuel economy standards, or the tailpipe standards, which have been proposed modifications are on the table from the EPA under the Trump administration. So there's a lot of things that are going in both directions. And ultimately in the report, we make the argument that there are more tailwinds than headwinds, but we don't see, we don't want this to be conflated with a naysayer view or anything, but we generally think that there's a bit more in favor of electrification of electric vehicle adoption than there is against it. So we have a generally positive view of how things are going to evolve here.
But one of the things that we asked you guys to focus on in the research, and that'll be coming out, should be released in the second quarter of 2019, was to help us understand pace of market adoption in different markets. So not all markets are California. Not all markets can be San Francisco or Boston or DC. Every different type of demographic profile within a market is going to evolve differently. So what have you learned in terms of, if I'm in a market, say I'm in Des Moines, I'm trying to figure out, okay, how fast might EVs grow? What would be some of the indicators that will give me an insight as to the pace of change that I might be able to expect?
Yeah, and this was a really interesting part of the study, is that we were allowed, again, given flexibility and working with a crew at the Fuels Institute to identify a broad range of metropolitan. Like we focused on metropolitan areas. So Des Moines, even though it's smaller, it's still designated as a metropolitan area. And so we looked at. So we had the multiple geographies, but we tried to identify things that we could look at, or market factors that we could look at that folks could keep an eye on, because ultimately we also take a measured view of EV charging infrastructure and the demands for it. We think that we need to understand, generally ICF's position is that we need to understand a lot more about where people are going to charge, when, and for how long. And those three things aren't as well understood as a lot of folks in the market would lead you to believe, based on what they're investing in or things like that. So we tried to take, again, a measured view and look at, across these metropolitan regions, what's the share of single family homes, with the hypothesis there is that it's easier to adopt an electric vehicle with access to easy charging at home. That's that convenience aspect. But then also, what are the travel patterns within that metropolitan region that would favor electric vehicle adoption, right? So whether, and so in that case, we're looking at commute distances and things along those lines. So we tried to identify factors like that would, maybe influence shifts between vehicle architectures, like a particular area favoring maybe plug-in hybrids, which have the combination electric plus a gasoline engine versus purely electric vehicles. So what are the factors that are going to influence that? And what are the market demands going to be as the market evolves? Like whether it, for us, again, one of these misconceptions is that like every market is going to evolve the same, and that we need this amount of infrastructure in this market because that's what people are telling us. It's generally like when you stake out claim like that, in my opinion, analysts are revealing their like a bias towards a future that is all electric vehicles or some plug-in hybrids or none. They're focused on one or the other, and we tried to take a focus on what would happen if it shifted one direction or the other. And then the other thing we did look at is we tried to understand what the potential impacts of lower vehicle ownership might be in some areas, and we tried to identify areas that had big planning efforts around shared mobility or reduced vehicle miles traveled by using other modes of transportation. So we looked at a couple different issues across these metropolitan regions to try and understand what the demand for charging infrastructure might look like as a function of a variety of these parameters.
Philip, you said something that's interesting, that there's a slide that John used, and I've kind of adopted it to any presentations I give. It's one of his first slides where it shows early 1900s, I think it's New York City, and it shows all of these horse and buggies, and everyone has one. And then a few years later, there's maybe one or two on the road, and they're all cars. And I start that off and kind of go with the presentation saying, see how quickly things can change. But I might adjust that a little bit based on exactly what you said. That wasn't the case everywhere in the United States. It didn't change overnight everywhere. It's a slow adoption rate in different areas depending on needs. And that's kind of what I'm hearing from you in terms of EVs. Different areas may have an adoption rate that will be different based on the needs of the consumer, correct?
Absolutely. And the needs of the consumer, and also just, consumer preferences vary considerably. Just if again, we point to a lot of national trends, but the split of, there's a trend towards, crossovers and SUVs and stuff like that, but that trend is stronger in some areas than others. So that area is going to have a harder time getting electric vehicles into the mix until there are more options in those market segments. Like those will come, but it's going to take a little bit longer. If you're an F-150 heavy market, they're not going to electrify that vehicle overnight, So if there's, again, like those consumer preferences, the way they travel and what they prefer to travel in, that stuff takes time to change.
So one of the things that I know a lot of analysts are saying is that one of the major hurdles to widespread EV adoption at a faster pace, and look, it's growing fast, but to get it even accelerated is infrastructure for recharging. So we start looking at what are the technological capabilities of the system. Early on, people say it's going to take you at least 12 hours to recharge an electric vehicle to 50% of capacity. And then you hear reports, we can recharge, 80% in 30 minutes. And now I've heard stories of, I think, 560 kilowatt charger or something like that. They can deliver unbelievable power. Only a couple cars can absorb that kind of charge. But where are we in terms of the capabilities of powering these vehicles in the market through recharging, from a technological capability of the equipment and from infrastructure needs? I mean, how many charging points do we need? Do we need 150,000 charging stations like we have gas stations, or do we need fewer? What are we looking at here?
And this area is really where we try to focus on. And a lot of it comes down to, I mentioned this before, people's view on what is going to be the preferred architecture for electric vehicles. And again, by that I'm distinguishing between like the plug-in hybrid and the fully electric vehicle. Because like you said, there is this interesting planning conflict in that we're trying to plan infrastructure for the vehicles that are likely to be on the road over the next 3 to 5 years. And there's going to be a lot of plug-in hybrids on the road in the next 3 to 5 years. It's about 50-50 right now, the market between those plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. But you have a lot of people, I think, who are trying to drag the market towards this, towards 300, 350 kW charging. That's really fast, right? Really fast charging. You need super cooling on, that technology has advanced very rapidly. And, but like you said, John, there aren't that many vehicles that can take that charging. So anybody who's pushing that view of 350 kW charging is basically tipping their hand that they're betting the farm on purely electric vehicles. But from, again, like from what we're trying to look at in study, and then what we've done for clients and whatnot is, well, what do you do with all the plug-in hybrids that are on the road and the first and second generation electric vehicles that can't even take more than 50 to 100 kW, right? So there is this interesting push-pull between wanting to drag the market towards this rapidly advancing charging systems. But again, we still have to satisfy the charging demands of the likely adopters over the next 3 to 7 years. And that transition to 300 plus kW is going to take some time, So again, we tend to focus on where is level 2 charging going to occur, and that's a little bit faster than that 12 hours you mentioned. That you can get a charge a bit faster at home or in public or at a workplace with that level 2 charging. And then how do you fill in the gaps through corridor or en route charging with this DC fast charging, these faster opportunities, which have a higher power, a higher cost, and lower dwell times, though, like that mimic or mirror the existing fueling infrastructure, refueling infrastructure for retail gasoline right now. So there's definitely a demand for all of that. And, to be frank, we're probably going to overbuild in each one of those markets because we don't know, right? I think to some extent over the next several years, we're going to overbuild capacity for charging over the next several years, but that's okay because that comes with like the higher cost of that to society is offset by the learnings from figuring out how people are charging, where they're charging, and for how long, where, when, and for how long. That's really I think some of the main pieces of information that we're missing right now. So unfortunately, we're in this period where we probably are going to have to build reinforced networks or this infrastructure network for charging that isn't necessarily the most efficient yet, but we need more information about how to make it more efficient.
Philip, that was a lot to think about, and we don't hear about those details as much. It's much flashier to talk about the cars, much flashier to talk about these things happening quicker than maybe many people actually think they will. But what about, or does this report really touch on what roles the utilities play and how it's different per state? Does it really go into that at all?
Yeah, we have a section in there about the role of utilities moving forward, and we talk about this. There's been more than $1 billion of approved investment by utilities in the charging infrastructure since I think it's 2013. So basically the investor-owned utilities, who are the main folks who are trying to advance some of this in a pilot phase, go to a public utility commission the same way they do with rates. You talk about how much you pay for electricity, and there's going to be rate changes, but they go to that same commission and they say, hey, we have this investment plan. We think that there's a role for utilities to play in this nascent or emerging transportation electrification market. Here is our plan to invest. Here are the impacts on ratepayers, and here are what the benefits to ratepayers are. And so we did break down, in the report, we talk about how much of that investment is being proposed for what we consider residential charging or non-residential charging, which is, and then, there is a distinction between single family versus multifamily in there. So just the number of filings per state and what they're focusing on, that is included in there, and how that's taking shape. That's still a really early market and all the utilities are pretty much I would argue like all of them are proposing pilot projects. The dollar amounts seem pretty large, but ultimately it's probably a fraction of what's required to accommodate EVs, 10 years down the road. So it's kind of feeling things out, and most of it is trying to figure out that role of the utilities. The utilities have an idea, and it differs amongst, some of them are pitching an own operate model, and other ones are pitching we're going to maintain our role in the infrastructure space, and somebody else will manage this site. So there's different business models that utilities prefer, but there is that is probably going to have to change within market segments even. So we do have a subsection in there talking about utilities and how that's emerging. And that's really fascinating because, again, there's some interesting push-pull there about competitiveness concerns and how do you ensure that there's a transition point if utilities are meant to be a catalyst. How do you make sure that they back off after the market kind of takes over so that you don't have a regulated monopoly kind of managing everything. So what does that transition period look like? So, but right now, again, like in the report, we focus on the emergence of the role of the utility and how that's been taking shape. So there is a good discussion in there on that. I think it's pretty accessible.
So we got a couple minutes left. Let's think about this from the perspective of a convenience fuel retailer. Electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles combined for about 331,000 units sold last year, 2018. It's a 75% increase in sales from 2017, but still only 1.9% of all new vehicles sold. So clearly fast growth, but with a small base, it's going to take a long time to gain traction. All the headlines are making you think, man, I got to figure out how to do this. If I'm a convenience retailer and I'm thinking about how do I position myself to remain relevant to my consumers long term, does it make sense to start thinking about installing chargers now? Are there opportunities to partner with people to kind of defray the cost? Is it too early? Is the technology not ready yet? If you were to be consulting with a convenience retailer, what kind of advice would you be giving them?
I think that's again a great question, and it is interesting because you have this conflict where there's this vision of electric vehicles as a new and different technology. So why would you want to jam our existing concept of refueling into it? But in reality, that has to be part of this charging infrastructure network. Like the opportunity to charge at places like convenience stores the same way they do, that people refuel at retail stations. The demand for that is probably going to, depending on people's evolving preference for charging at home or workplace. Those are two things, to me at least, that are going to present a challenge to convenience stores, because it really is and I mean that by a challenge not in a negative way, but it's how are you supposed to track how many employers are installing infrastructure and maybe chasing off some of that demand, or how do you track people's preferences for charging at home? These are things that market analysts have a hard time chasing down. So those two things, how much charging is going to be left over after the vehicle is able to charge where it's parked the most, is going to characterize the demand for charging at like a refueling station or at a DC fast charging. So the key, I think, John, to what you said is partnership. I think that there are several charging companies that are focused on deploying DC fast charging equipment, and they're keen. I mean, one of their biggest issues is always land acquisition costs or identifying a partner that can get infrastructure in the ground. And that's what convenience stores are really good at. That's something that they excel at, is access, convenience, those things that, to some extent, some of these infrastructure providers are technology providers, and they don't get that aspect of the market as well as the convenience store would. So identify a partner and leverage, and a lot of those companies are savvy at getting grant money or at getting public dollars that are dedicated towards this to spur the market. So, you can kind of offload that as a convenience store. You can kind of offload that core competency, or that, whatever strategic consulting terminology you want to put in there. But that partnership that emerges, that kind of gives you an opportunity to get your feet wet, figure out, this investment might work. But, again, through that partnership, you can kind of start to figure that out. And that way you're not pushed outside of your areas of expertise, if you will, and into an area into a vast unknown.
Right. Well, Philip, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your insights and your thoughts on the EV market. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to be sorted out going forward. If they want more information on ICF, it's icf.com, right?
That's right. Yes, sir. And
the Fuel Intensity Report that you've been working on for us will be available second quarter, third quarter 2019 at fuelsinstitute.org. Available for download, free of charge for anybody that's interested. And stay tuned. Convenience Matters going forward, and Fuels Institute will keep you abreast on what's going on in the EV market and everything else related to transportation. Thank you guys very much. And Philip, have a great afternoon, man.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Donovan. Have a good day.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.